The slap was meant for the housekeeper. She was 27 years old, shaking so hard the stain kit rattled in her hands, and the woman who owned the room had already decided she was guilty. So I stepped in front of her, and I took it. 200 people stopped breathing at once. Vivian Carrington smiled at me and said a single father with my paycheck should learn to remember his place. I didn't answer her. I looked past her shoulder, at table 7, where an old man had been eating alone all evening. Then he rose, slowly, out of his chair. If you believe kindness can outlast power, subscribe now and stay with me while one quiet room turns completely around. It happened on a Tuesday in the middle of November, and I remember every minute of that night, including the minutes I did not live through myself, because in the weeks that followed I learned exactly what almost every person in that room had been thinking. My name is Nolan Pierce. I was 42 years old, the evening operations and maintenance manager at the Carrington Grand Chicago, and I had spent 8 years learning that building the way some men learn a second language. I knew which elevator groaned for a week before it failed. I knew that the ice machine on 4 ran warm every winter because a contractor had cheated on insulation back in 1998, and nobody had ever paid to open that wall again. I knew the first name of every housekeeper on the evening rotation, which of them were sending money to family in other states, and which of them were one broken transmission away from losing everything they had. That Tuesday the hotel was hosting the Fall Partners dinner in the Meridian Room, which meant lenders, corporate clients, 2 members of the board, and the entire executive floor of Carrington Hospitality Group crowded under one ceiling. At 20 minutes before 7, the air handling unit that served that room lost a bearing on the supply fan and started throwing a vibration alarm. And the room temperature began climbing 1 degree every 4 minutes. I had already been on since 7 that morning, covering a shift for Kyle Bennett, whose wife had given birth 11 days earlier and who was running on the kind of sleep that makes men careless around live equipment. Kyle offered to stay. I told him to go home and hold his son. That is not heroism, and I want to be honest about it, because the whole story people later told about me got the size of things wrong. It was just arithmetic. I had 1 child at home with a sitter, and Kyle had a newborn, and the fan didn't care which of us climbed up to it. So I went up through the service corridor with a bag of tools and a spare belt, and I lay on my back on a catwalk above the ceiling of the most expensive room in the hotel, while the string quartet tuned up 11 feet below me. My phone buzzed twice while I was working. The first message was the sitter saying my daughter had finished her homework without being asked. The second was the school billing office, reminding me that $940 was due Friday and that a late payment would carry a fee. I read both messages lying on my back in the dark with grease on my knuckles, and then I put the phone in my pocket and finished the repair, because the second message was not going to get easier by staring at it. My car was a sedan with 219,000 miles on it, and a cracked rear bumper I had zip-tied myself. There was nothing about me that looked like leverage. At 7:10 I came down through the pantry door to check the discharge temperature at the far diffuser, which put me at the edge of the dining room in a gray maintenance shirt with my name stitched over the pocket. That is when I noticed table 7. It sat against the west wall, half behind a column, the worst two-top in the room, the table we gave to guests we quietly hoped would not linger. An older man was sitting there alone. He was eating roast chicken and drinking water. No wine, no phone on the cloth, no folder of papers, no companion. He was simply watching the room, unhurried, the way a farmer watches weather, and every so often he wrote something on the back of his check with a short pencil. I remember thinking he looked like a retired schoolteacher who had saved for a nice evening, and I remember hoping the servers were not ignoring him for the tables with better suits. I had no idea I was looking at Gideon Ashcroft, 68 years old, founder of Ashcroft Capital, the man whose fund had bought the largest block of voting equity in Carrington Hospitality Group 4 years earlier when the company was 9 weeks from failing to make payroll across 11 properties. He had reserved that table under his mother's maiden name. He had told no one in the company he was coming. At 7:22, 3 black sedans pulled under the porte-cochere on Michigan Avenue, and the whole building changed its posture the way a schoolyard changes when the principal walks out the door, because Vivian Carrington had arrived. She found me in under 20 seconds. I was crouched at the baseboard by the west service door with a temperature probe in the return grill, which put a man in a gray work shirt inside the sight line of a table where 2 lenders were being seated. I heard her heels stop. I heard the small clearing of a throat that Preston Vance, our chief operating officer, made whenever he wanted to warn someone, without taking responsibility for the warning. Then Vivienne asked, not to me but about me, in a voice pitched precisely loud enough to reach 3 tables, why maintenance was standing where guests could see him. I stood up and answered her directly, because in 8 years I had learned that vagueness gets people in my department fired. I told her the supply fan serving this room had failed a bearing before service, that the unit was repaired, and that I was verifying the discharge temperature so the room would hold at 70 degrees through dessert, instead of climbing into the high 70s while 200 people ate lamb. It was, factually, the single most useful sentence any employee said to her that evening. She looked at the probe in my hand as though I had brought a dead animal into her dining room. What she said, and I can give it to you exactly because I have heard it played back since, was this. Then fix things before important people arrive. They pay these prices so they never have to look at people like you. 2 of the middle managers behind her laughed. It was not real laughter. It was the small apologetic noise men make when they want the powerful person to know they are on her side and they want you to know they are sorry, and it is somehow worse than silence. Marilyn Hodge, our chief financial officer, looked at the carpet. Preston Vance looked at his watch as if the time were suddenly urgent. I said 1 word. Understood. Then I clipped the probe to my belt, and I waited because the polite thing was to let her finish and pass. She did not pass. I know now from a conversation I had months later with someone who had worked beside her for 6 years, exactly what happened in her mind in that moment, and it explains the entire night. Vivienne had expected me to apologize. She had expected the small performance of shame, the lowered head, the stammered promise to be invisible faster next time, because that performance was how she confirmed the order of the room to herself. What she received instead was a competent man giving her accurate information and accepting her insult without flinching, and that felt to her like insolence wearing the mask of obedience. The dinner ran clean until 9 o'clock, and then it broke over almost nothing, which is how these things always begin. Vivienne had left the head table to greet Curtis Lang, a lender who controlled a construction facility she wanted renewed at a better rate, and she turned too quickly to catch his arm. Her elbow clipped a flute on a passing tray. Champagne went across the tray, across the cuff and forearm of her ivory coat, and a thin arc of it landed on the tablecloth, and the server holding the tray, a 23-year-old named Adam Reyes, who had been on the floor for 4 months, froze with the dead certainty that his life had just ended. She told him loudly that he had walked into her, which was not true, and the banquet captain moved him off the floor while somebody radioed upstairs for the stain kit, because that coat was not a coat you hand to an ordinary cleaner. That radio call was answered by Tessa Monroe, and that is where a small, stupid accident turned into the thing I still think about when I cannot sleep. Tessa was 27. She had been at the Carrington Grand about 8 months, transferred from a smaller property on the north side, and she was the best housekeeper I had ever watched work, which is a real skill and an invisible one. She was quiet in the specific way that people are quiet when they have learned that speaking up costs them. She knew fabric. She knew that champagne on wool is sugar and acid and time, and that you have maybe 15 minutes before the sugar sets and starts pulling color out of the fiber. She came down the service stairs with the kit in both hands, and she came fast because she thought she was there to save the coat. She never got to save anything. What she got instead was a woman with a wet sleeve who had just been humiliated in front of a lender she needed, standing in the middle of a room she believed she owned, looking for somewhere to put the feeling. Tessa knelt and asked to see the cuff. She explained calmly and correctly that she could blot the sugar out with cool water and a neutral solution right there and stabilize it, and that if the coat went into a hot press or a dry cycle first, the stain would set permanently and cost the coat. Vivienne told her to hurry. Tessa said the process itself took the time it took, that rushing it would drive the sugar deeper, and that she would rather do it right than fast. I want to be precise about what happened next, because it is the hinge of everything. Vivienne had set her clutch down on the corner of the table when she turned to greet Curtis Lang, a small cream-colored thing with a gold clasp, and while she was standing there with her arm out and her attention on her sleeve, she looked down and saw a scratch on the clasp. A hairline scratch, maybe half an inch, on the metal edge nearest the table. She had struck that clasp against the table edge herself when she spun to catch Lang's arm. 11 people were in a position to have seen it. Not one of them had been watching a purse. But Vivian looked from the scratch to the young woman kneeling at her feet with a cloth in her hand, and the story assembled itself in her head in about a second and a half, and once it had assembled she believed it completely. She asked Tessa what she had done to the bag. Tessa said honestly that she had never touched it, that she had come down with the kit and gone straight to the sleeve. Vivian asked again, louder, and I watched the tables nearest to them go quiet in that spreading way, one conversation at a time, like ice forming. Somebody at the head table said her name once softly, trying to give her an exit. She did not take it. She told Tessa that the clutch was worth $11,000, that it was one of 9 ever made in that color, and that she was not going to be lied to by a girl who cleaned bathrooms for a living. Tessa said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry it's damaged, but I didn't do it." And Vivian Carrington leaned down over her and said, in a voice everyone within 4 tables could hear, "They hired you to clean rooms. Don't behave as though your opinion has any weight in this room." I have replayed that sentence more times than I can count. There were at least 5 people standing close enough to stop it, and every one of them outranked me, and every one of them knew she had knocked that clasp herself, and not one of them said a single word. Preston Vance actually turned partly away, the way you turn from a wreck you have decided is not yours. Marilyn Hodge began studying her phone with tremendous concentration. What Vivian wanted in the 90 seconds after that sentence was very specific, and specificity is what destroyed her later. She wanted a verbal apology in front of the lenders, and she wanted Tessa to sign an acknowledgement agreeing to a payroll deduction of $2,000, spread over pay periods, as partial restitution for the clutch. She said the word restitution twice. She said it the way people say a word they have heard lawyers use. There was no incident report, no witness statement, no photograph, no security review, nothing but a wet sleeve and a decision, and she wanted it settled on the carpet before dessert so that the evening could resume being about her. Tessa refused. She did it beautifully, and she did it quietly, which is why it hit so hard. She got up off her knees, held the stain kit against her hip, and said that she would gladly finish treating the coat, that she was sorry for the accident, and that she was not going to say she broke something she had never held. 200 people heard a housekeeper tell the chief executive no. I do not think anyone had done that to Vivian's face in her adult life. Whatever composure she had been holding came off her like a coat sliding off a chair, and she took a step toward Tessa, and that step was not a negotiating step. That is when I arrived and I put myself between them, and I said the least dramatic sentence available. I said that the restaurant had 4 cameras with coverage of that table, that the request took a phone call, and that we could all know what happened in under 10 minutes instead of guessing. I want to be clear that I was not defending Tessa's character. I was offering the room a fact. Facts are the only currency a man in a gray shirt has, and in 8 years I had watched them diffuse almost everything, because most fights inside a hotel are simply 2 people with different information. Vivian turned to me, and what she said was, "I didn't ask you." I told her still calmly that she was accusing an employee of destroying property and asking for money out of that employee's wages, and that if the footage backed her, nothing was lost by looking. She stared at me with an expression I had never seen on her before, and I understand it now. To her I had done something far worse than disagree. I had in front of witnesses offered a procedure. Procedures apply to everyone. Procedures do not care whose name is over the door, and if the room accepted my procedure, then her word had just stopped being the highest authority in the Meridian Room, so she came at the only part of me she thought was soft. She said, and this is close to exact, that I was a maintenance manager on a maintenance manager's salary with a child at home and no wife to help carry it, that I had turned down 2 positions in 3 years because I was not willing to travel, and that a man who had limited himself that thoroughly should understand better than anyone in this building exactly what a job is worth. She had read my file at some point. That is the detail that stayed with me. Somewhere in the last year, my personnel file had crossed her desk, and the only thing she had retained from it was the shape of my leverage. Then she said the rest of it, which was that if I said one more word about cameras, I would be finding out what the market pays for men who cannot follow instructions. I did not answer her, and Tessa, God bless her, did not fold. She said into that silence, "I never touched the bag." And Vivian Carrington raised her hand. I saw it start. There is a tell, a small drop of the shoulder that comes a half second before the arm, and I had seen it in other rooms in other years, and my body moved before any part of my mind had a vote. I turned my shoulder and stepped left in front of Tessa, and I took the slap on the side of my face. It was not a movie slap. It made a flat, small, ugly sound, and the whole room heard it, and then the whole room heard nothing at all. I did not raise my hands. I did not raise my voice. I turned my face back toward her and looked at her, and I kept my hands open at my sides where everyone could see them, because I had a daughter at home and a mortgage and one credible witness worth of reputation, and I understood in that half-second that whatever I did next would be the only thing anyone remembered. So I did nothing, deliberately, which is the hardest work I have ever done. Somewhere behind me a fork hit a plate. Curtis Lang said, "Vivienne," in the voice of a man who has just watched his own money get more complicated. Tessa was crying without sound, which I did not see, but the cameras did. Vivienne looked at her own hand for perhaps a second, and I watched her make her final mistake of the evening, which was to double rather than retreat. She smiled at me, that thin correcting smile she used in meetings, and she said, "You wanted to play the hero, then carry the cost." She out loud to the room that I was suspended without pay effective immediately, pending termination review for insubordination and for intimidating a guest of the hotel. She told the banquet captain to have me escorted out through the loading dock. She used the word escorted. Then she turned back toward the head table, expecting the room to turn with her the way it always had. The room did not turn, and in the pause where her authority was supposed to be, everyone in the Meridian room heard a chair move against the floor at table 7. He did not hurry. That is the part I remember most, because I had braced for noise, and there wasn't any. Gideon Ashcroft stood up beside the worst table in the room, folded his napkin once, and laid it on the cloth next to the check he had been writing on all evening. He was 68 years old, wearing a gray suit that did not fit him the way expensive clothes fit executives, and he was not a big man. No security detail came through the doors because he had not brought one. He simply stood, and then he walked 8 or 9 steps toward us and stopped. And the temperature of that room changed more in those 9 steps than my broken air handler had changed it all night. Preston Vance recognized him first, and I watched a grown man's face lose its color in real time. Curtis Lang recognized him second, which was arguably worse for Vivienne, because Lang had sat across a table from Ashcroft in 2021 during the recapitalization and had never forgotten it. Marilyn Hodge put her phone down. One of the board members at the head table, a woman named Eleanor Fitch, stood up halfway and then sat back down without seeming to notice she had done it. Vivienne turned around last, still holding the momentum of her own dismissal, and I saw the exact instant her face understood before her mouth did. She said, "Mr. Ashcroft," and it came out at half the volume she intended. He did not look at me, and he did not look at Tessa. That surprised me at the time, and I understand it perfectly now. A man who has spent 5 decades taking apart companies knows that the first person who moves toward the victim loses control of the sequence. He looked only at Vivienne, and he asked her one question. "On what grounds did you just suspend that man?" No adjectives, no outrage. Just the question a person asks when he intends to write the answer down. Vivienne was very good, and I want to give her that, because it makes what happened next mean something. She did not panic. She rebuilt the story in about 4 seconds. And it was a professional job. She said that there had been a service failure and a damaged personal item, that a member of housekeeper had been dishonest about it, that the maintenance manager had abandoned his post to insert himself into a guest matter that was not remotely his responsibility, and that he had done so in a manner she found physically intimidating in front of the company's lending partners. She never mentioned the slap. She built a whole architecture with the load-bearing wall removed and hoped nobody would lean on it. Gideon listened to all of it without interrupting, and then he asked, "Does this room have cameras?" The banquet captain said yes before anyone could stop him. Gideon asked how long it would take to see the last 20 minutes. I said from where I was standing that our overnight security officer could bring a laptop to the pantry in about 4 minutes. It was the first thing I had said since the slap, and my own voice sounded strange to me. Gideon nodded once and said, "Then we'll all wait 4 minutes," and he said it to the room rather than to Vivienne, which is how everyone present learned who was actually in charge of the evening. Ray Halloran came up from the security office with a laptop under his arm, and because there was no clean way to do it privately, we did it right there, half behind the column at table 7 with Vivienne, Gideon, Preston Vance, Curtis Lang, Eleanor Fitch, Tessa, and me standing in a rough half circle around a 14-inch screen. The footage from the Northwest camera was clear, and it was in color, and it had a timestamp. At 8:59 and 40 seconds, Vivian turns to catch Curtis Lang's arm, and her hip swings her clutch against the corner edge of the table. She does not notice. Minutes later, Tessa Monroe enters the frame from the left, kneels, and never comes within 8 inches of that bag. At 9:22 and 11 seconds, Vivian's shoulder drops and her arm comes up, and a man in a gray shirt steps sideways into the space in front of a kneeling woman. It was not over. Gideon Ashcroft looked away from the screen, and for the first time all evening he looked directly at me, and he put out his hand and he said, "Mr. Pierce, we finally meet." I shook his hand because I did not know what else to do with my own. And behind him I watched Vivienne Carrington's head come around slowly, because she had just heard the chief owner of Carrington Hospitality Group use the full name of a night maintenance manager, as though he had been waiting 6 months to say it out loud. He had been. That is the part of this story nobody in that room was prepared for, including me, because I had never once expected it to surface in public. In late May of that year, Ashcroft Capital had opened a quiet internal review of Carrington Hospitality, and it was not opened because of any complaint. It was opened because of arithmetic. Property-level operating margins across our 11 hotels had improved by 9.5% over 6 quarters, which was extraordinary in that market, while voluntary staff departures in housekeeping, engineering, and food service had climbed to 58% annually. Gideon told me later that in 50 years he had never once seen those two numbers move that way together for an honest reason. Cost does not vanish, it relocates. Usually it relocates into the bodies of the people nobody counts. His team sent quiet requests to 12 property and regional managers asking for actual maintenance logs, actual scheduling records, and copies of every directive concerning deferred repair, and what came back from 11 of the 12 was a masterpiece of nothing: polished summaries, corrected spreadsheets. 2 of them forwarded the request to Preston Vance's office within the hour, which was itself a finding, because men protect whoever signs their bonus. 1 person answered fully, "I did." Between June and October, I sent Ashcroft's review team the real maintenance ledger for the Carrington Grand, kept by hand in a composition notebook, because I had learned in year 3 not to trust a system somebody upstairs could edit. I sent the deferred repair correspondence, including an email from the corporate operations account instructing me to postpone a fire pump overhaul and 2 elevator governor replacements past the end of the quarter so that the capital line would present cleanly. I sent vendor correspondence showing that 3 suppliers had been pushed to a lower specification of linen, cleaning chemical, and filtration media, while the invoices continued to describe the original grade. And I sent the overtime records, which were the worst of it, because the schedule showed hours that the payroll export did not. And Tessa Monroe was the second person. Nobody knew that either, because the payroll export had been edited and the schedule had not. I needed a third record to prove which one was lying, and the third record existed only on paper. The handwritten sign-in and sign-out sheets that housekeeping supervisors kept on a clipboard in the linen room and threw away every month. Tessa had noticed, back in the spring, that her check kept coming up 90 minutes short on turnover days. She started photographing that clipboard at the end of every shift, for herself, with no plan and no lawyer, because she was 27 and quietly furious and did not know what else to do. When I asked in July whether anyone had kept the paper sheets, she brought me 9 months of them on a memory card and asked me only one question, which was whether it would get her fired. Which is why when he turned back to face the half circle at table 7, the sentence he chose took the last floorboard out from under her. He said, "Understand what you just watched." That man had no idea I was in this room. He said it evenly. He explained, in 3 sentences, that Nolan Pierce had been the only manager in 11 properties to answer his review honestly, that Ashcroft Capital had never disclosed that fact to anyone inside Carrington, and that nothing about the last 20 minutes could have been a performance for his benefit, because I did not know he existed. Then he said the part I have never gotten out of my head. He stepped in front of her for nothing. There was no audience that could help him. That's the only kind of character worth paying for. She turned to the board members and the lender, not to Gideon, which was smart, and she built her last case. She said that I had been passed over for a director-level position in 2023 and had made no secret of my resentment. She said I had removed internal operational data from company systems and transmitted it to an outside party without authorization, which was in her framing a plain breach of confidentiality and possibly of my employment agreement. She said I had deliberately fed a partial and distorted picture to an investor in order to damage the company's standing. And she said I had recruited hourly staff into that effort, encouraging junior employees to gather records on management, which she called, and I remember the phrase precisely, an organized campaign against the executive team. Gideon Ashcroft did not argue with any of it. He asked a question instead, and it was 6 words long, and he asked it almost gently. "Are you certain you still can?" Vivian stopped. I have never watched a person's confidence come apart that fast. She asked him what he meant, and her voice was steady, and her hands were not. He told her, and he told the whole half-circle because the board members needed to hear it as much as she did. The recapitalization agreement of 2021, the one that had kept 11 hotels open and every payroll funded, contained protective provisions that survived the transaction, and one of them was a covenant Ashcroft's counsel had insisted on in every deal since 1994. Under that covenant, once the controlling investor formally notifies the company that a governance review has identified indications of misreported financial or operational data, any adverse employment action against a person who has furnished information to that review requires prior approval of the full board, not the chief executive's approval, the board's. Then he told her when the notice had been delivered. That afternoon at 4:11 by hand to the office of the General Counsel of Carrington Hospitality Group. 5 hours and 30 minutes before she raised her hand in the Meridian Room. The notice named 2 categories of protected persons without naming individuals, and both of us were inside it, me for the operational records and Tessa for the payroll documentation. Vivienne had not read it. Her general counsel had been trying to reach her since 4:30, and she had been in a car, and then she had been in this room, and the message had been sitting on her phone under the champagne stain the whole time. Which meant that what the room had just watched was no longer a bad temper and a personnel dispute. In the space of 18 minutes, in front of the controlling investor, 2 board members, and a lender, the chief executive of Carrington Hospitality Group had attempted to suspend and then terminate the principal witness in a live governance review of misreported data, after striking him on an accusation the security footage disproved. Every single thing that had made her feel powerful that evening had become an exhibit. Gideon put it in 1 sentence, and he did not raise his voice for it either. "Miss Carrington, you have spent the last 20 minutes demonstrating, in front of witnesses, precisely the problem my review was open to examine." Then he looked at his watch and said that since 4 of the 7 directors were already in the building, he saw no reason to wait until 9 in the morning. They convened in the Lakeview room on the 2nd floor at 11 o'clock at night, with 2 more directors joining by phone from Boston and Denver. Somebody found sandwiches. Somebody else found the general counsel, who arrived in a windbreaker over a dress shirt and looked like a man who had already forecast his entire week. Tessa and I were asked to wait outside and then to come in, and I remember standing in that hallway at 11 o'clock at night in a work shirt with a bruise coming up on my cheekbone, holding a memory card in my pocket, and thinking that my daughter's tuition was due Friday, and I might already be unemployed in a way no covenant could fix. We went in together. I asked for that, and Gideon agreed to it because I was not going to let Tessa Monroe be the only hourly employee in a room full of directors. She spoke first for about 4 minutes, and she was extraordinary. She did not accuse anyone, she simply described her job, that the standard for a full turnover was 28 minutes, that on Sundays she was assigned 14 rooms in a 7-hour shift, that when she finished at 90 minutes past her end time she wrote it on the clipboard, and that the deposit in her account had matched that clipboard exactly twice since February. Then she put the photographs of 9 months of sign-in sheets on the table beside the payroll export, and the 2 documents sat there disagreeing with each other in front of 7 directors. Vivian defended herself for 19 minutes, and her defense was the one every executive in that position reaches for. She said she had set goals, not methods. She said she had asked her leadership team to find efficiency and had never once instructed anyone to falsify a record, and that if subordinates had chosen to interpret ambitious targets as permission to edit payroll, that was a failure of management below her, not of governance above her, and it was working a little. I could see two directors on the phone line wanting it to be true, because the version where the company has a communication problem is so much cheaper than the version where it has a chief executive problem. Then Preston Vance spoke, and I did not expect it, and I have never decided whether it was courage or self-preservation, and I have decided it does not matter. He said, looking at the table rather than at her, that Nolan Pierce had raised the fire pump, the filter cycle, and the overtime discrepancy in a March operations meeting, and in a written escalation the previous November, and in at least 2 others he could locate if given an hour. He said he had personally told me that the quarter could not absorb it. He said the word methods had come up in his presence more than once, and not from a subordinate. It took him 90 seconds, and when he finished, the room had stopped being a debate about interpretation. Eleanor Fitch asked me directly what I wanted. That question surprised me more than the slap had. I had rehearsed evidence, not desires, and what came out was not a demand for anyone's job. Because I had watched enough of these buildings to know that removing one person and calling it justice is how the same thing happens again in 4 years. I said, if an employee has to be afraid of losing her job for telling the truth, this system will keep failing no matter how much equipment I fix. I said we needed a way for a housekeeper to report an edited time card without going through the person who edited it. Then I sat down because my hands had started shaking, which they had not done all night. The board voted at 12 minutes past 1 in the morning to suspend Vivian Carrington from all executive authority, pending an independent investigation, to name Eleanor Fitch as interim chief executive, and to retain outside counsel and a forensic accounting firm. The vote was 6-1. Vivian gathered her phone and her damaged clutch and walked out of the Lakeview room into an empty second-floor corridor, and for the first time in her adult life, nobody stood up and followed her out. I did not enjoy watching it. I want to say I did, and people always assume I did, but she looked in that hallway like a person who had just discovered she was standing in a building rather than owning one, and there is nothing satisfying in that. The investigation took 7 weeks, and it was thorough and boring and had nothing cinematic in it, which is exactly why it worked. The forensic team pulled 4 years of payroll exports against paper records at 6 properties and found a pattern, not an incident. Approximately $960,000 in worked hours reduced or removed across 3 departments, most of it in increments of 40 minutes. They found deferred capital and maintenance items reported as complete at 4 hotels. They found the specification downgrades. And they found in the end that the operating margin improvement the company had been celebrating for 6 quarters was roughly 2/3 real and 1/3 borrowed from the future and from the people cleaning the rooms. Vivian Carrington was removed as chief executive in January and left the board that spring. Not for the slap. I need that understood, because the version people prefer is the one where a rich woman loses an empire because she hit a maintenance man, and that version is a fairy tale that teaches nothing. She lost her position because of 4 years of governance conduct that the slap made impossible to keep covering. The hand she raised in the Meridian room was not the crime, it was the flashlight. Her family name stayed carved over the entrance, because that was in the deed and the company kept it, and I think that is a fair and slightly cruel ending that nobody planned. Tessa Monroe received a formal written apology from the interim chief executive, which she has framed, and back pay of $4,180 covering 9 months of removed hours and interest. In March, she moved into the position she had actually wanted since the day she was hired, as a housekeeping training and standards coordinator, which meant she spent her days teaching new hires the things she knew about fabric and time, and how many minutes a room honestly takes. The last time I checked, the average turnover standard at our property had been rewritten to 22 rooms per 2 people per shift instead of 14 per one, because someone had finally asked a person who did the work. Gideon Ashcroft asked to see me alone in early February in a small office on the 4th floor of a building on LaSalle Street, and I went in expecting to be thanked and dismissed. He did not offer me money. I have thought about that a lot. A check would have been the easiest thing in the world for him, and it would have made me a man who had been paid off, and he understood the difference. Instead, he slid a single page across the desk describing a position that did not exist yet. Regional Director of Hotel Operations and Staff Standards, responsible for the operating and labor practices of 11 properties, reporting to the board's Audit and Governance Committee rather than to any operating executive. The salary was slightly more than 3 times what I had been making. But the part that undid me was on the second half of the page, where the role was structured around a maximum of 6 overnight trips a year, with the regional work done through property teams and video conference, because someone had gone to the trouble of finding out that I had turned down 2 promotions in 3 years for a reason, and had built the job around the reason instead of asking me to abandon it. I sat there for a while. Then I asked him the only question I actually needed answered, which was, "Is this because I took that slap?" He said no. He said it immediately, and he sounded almost offended. Then he said it's because you stood up 6 months ago when there was no one in the room to see it. He told me that anybody can be brave for 11 seconds in front of 200 people, that he had watched dozens of men do it and then go back to their desks and approve the same rot, and that what he needed was a person who had already been doing the unglamorous version for 2.5 years with nothing to gain and a child at home to lose. I signed the page. Then I went out to the parking garage, sat in my 219,000-mile sedan for about 10 minutes, and called the school billing office to pay off the semester in full. 9 months later, the Carrington Grand Chicago is not a paradise, and I would not trust anyone who told you it was. There are still nights when we are short 2 people and a whole floor runs behind. Still guests who speak to a 20-year-old server in ways they would never speak to me. Still quarters where somebody upstairs wants a number that the building cannot honestly produce. What changed is narrower and more durable than a happy ending. There is now an independent reporting line that goes to the governance committee and not through the property manager. There is a written protection policy for employees who furnish information to any audit, with a defined process and an actual person's name attached to it. Time records are reconciled monthly against paper sign-in sheets by someone in a different department. And there is a written standard, which I helped draft, that any employee may decline to continue serving a guest who threatens or degrades them, with management support and no penalty, and it has been invoked 14 times and upheld 14 times. I kept driving the old sedan for another 8 months, which people found strange, and which I never found strange at all. It started every morning. I still walk the service corridors on Tuesday and Thursday evenings when I am in the building, and I still greet the housekeepers by their names. And I have learned that this is not a small thing, because the specific texture of being invisible is that nobody ever uses your name. 2 of the people I greet in that hallway have since moved into supervisory roles. One of them told me she stayed at the company because of one hallway conversation in a year when she had 2 other offers, which is the kind of thing that ought to be on a balance sheet somewhere and never is. On a Thursday in September, I came down from a governance committee call that had run long, around 9 in the evening, and cut through the Meridian Room because it is the shortest way to the West Stair. The room was 2/3 full, the quartet was gone, replaced by a piano nobody needed, and the west wall was in shadow. And there, against that wall, half behind the column, at the worst 2-top in the entire restaurant, sat a 69-year-old man eating roast chicken and drinking water with no phone on the cloth. He had not told anyone he was coming this time either. He saw me and moved the second chair out with his foot, not the head table, not the private dining room upstairs, which is bigger and quieter and has his fund's name on the plaque outside it now. Table 7. I sat down and we talked for a while about filtration cycles and interest rates and his granddaughter's application essays. And then he put down his fork and asked me the question he had apparently been carrying for 10 months. He wanted to know what actually made me step in front of Tessa Monroe that night, given that I had a child at home, no savings worth the word, and every reason on earth to keep my mouth shut and my eyes down. I told him the truth, which is less flattering than the story people tell. I said, I don't think I was the only person in that room who could have done it. I was just the first one willing to move. There were 5 people standing closer than I was. Every one of them knew she had scratched that clasp herself. They were not cowards. They were just each waiting to see whether it was going to cost them, and that is a very human thing to do, and it is how a whole building full of decent people ends up watching a 27-year-old woman get accused of something she did not do. Courage is almost never a rare substance. It is just badly distributed, and it needs one person to go first. If you pull back from that table, the way a camera would, you would see 2 men eating chicken in the worst seat in an expensive room. Farther out, near the service door where I once stood with a coil of rope over my shoulder, You would see Tayessa Monroe in a supervisor's jacket walking 3 new hires through the room, pointing out where the linen carts stage and where the guest sight lines break, and one of those new hires is a single mother of 2 who will be a floor supervisor within a year. And behind them at the west wall you would see one empty chair at table 7, the chair a billionaire once stood up out of. And I want the last thing said about that night to be accurate. He stood up second. A man in a gray work shirt with grease on his knuckles and $940 due on Friday stood up first, and that is the only reason the chair mattered at all.